Okay, today my guest is Professor Fiona Moore. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Fiona as a person, Professor Moore is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Moore's research is on international human resource management, cross-cultural management, gender and ethnic diversity in MNCs, anthropology and its applications in business studies, German, Korean, and Taiwanese business cultures. She has served or serves as an editor at Cross-Cultural and Strategic Management Journal, Global Networks Journal, JIBS, Critical Perspectives on International Business Journal, and the Wagner Review. She received the AIB Insights 20th Anniversary Award in 2021. She was nominated for the Haynes Prize for Most Promising Young Scholar in 2006 and 2010, and she was the first runner-up at Women in AIB Best Paper Award in 2008. Thank you, Fiona, for joining us.
Oh, thank you for asking me.
Fiona, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Well, it depends on when I was a child. My first ambition at the age of 5 was to be an astronaut. But I rethought that one when I remember I watched an episode of The $6 Million Man, and he got quite badly hurt, and I thought, I don't think I want to be an astronaut if that's what happens to astronauts. So later on I thought maybe I'd be a teacher, and then when I found out about anthropology as a subject, I got interested in that. But until I went to university, I thought I was thinking more of psychology, because most of my family are in the medical profession, and a lot of my mother's family are psychologists. But once I got to university, I really got cemented into the anthropology mold, and that's where I went after that. I often describe myself as, an anthropologist who wandered into a business school 20 years ago and stayed because they keep feeding her. But yeah, I'm still an anthropologist, but now I'm an anthropologist with a business and HRM focus.
Perfect. And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Toronto, in Canada.
Okay.
Which is quite a nice place to grow up, really.
Yeah. And can you remember the earliest moments of awareness between foreign versus domestic?
Well, I can and I can't, because of growing up in Toronto in the 70s, and I suspect it's much the same now. There were I could think almost everybody I knew had an immigrant parent and or grandparent. My father was an immigrant. Most of the children I went to school with were the same. The ones whose parents, whose families went further back were, there, but they were unusual. And even then, even people, both of whose parents had been born in Canada usually had a grandparent at the very least. So, I was kind of always aware that there were places other than Canada, because that was where your parents came from. In terms of, foreign versus domestic, well, that's a slightly different, the more complex issue. Eventually, sort of, you go to school, you learn about places overseas, and you start to kind of things start to fall into place. So yeah, the place my father's from is England, and it's got this history, and other people's families are from India, and that's also got this history, and you start to build it up.
You mentioned anthropology. How did you get into that area for at least for interest, and then how did it lead to IB?
Well, I knew anthropology was a thing from quite early age, because both my mother and my grandmother had studied it, even though they didn't go into it professionally. And my grandmother's professor, actually, the anthropology professor, had overseen the establishment of a totem pole in the Royal Ontario Museum. And if you go to today, you can still see that totem pole. But she said at the time he was constantly fretting about whether he'd measured it just right or whether it would wound up being too large. So yeah, colonial past. Okay, yeah, but so I was aware of it, and also aware, that it's a discipline. It's discipline done by people, and that it generally involves studying people who aren't in your group. Now, traditional anthropology, of course, involves is, as I said, a little bit of a colonialist overtone. You study, you go from you go from the center and you go out to the periphery and you study tribal people or peasant societies, and then you go back home to your university and you write about them. But even then, because of my mother and grandmother studying it, I knew there was differences there. For instance, they had copies of the Children of Sanchez and, the Newtown studies and the like. So I knew that urban anthropology was a thing. And by the time I was in university, there was quite a lot of attention being given to Japan, which had started off as a traditional anthropological subject. People in the 19th and early 20th century going from Europe and North America to study what was at the time a fairly developing society, low technology, peasants, feudal. And then suddenly, of course, all that reversed. And so the anthropology of Japan uniquely wound up with a huge canon of studies of businesses and corporations of all sizes. So I thought, yeah, that's very interesting. And I think I'd like to study that because clearly that's something different. And then by the time I was looking for thinking about graduate school and thinking about things that could be studied, it was the turn of the millennium, and the post-colonial and anti-colonial movements were in full swing in anthropology. People were starting to ask very pointed questions, and one of the main ones being, aren't we just going from the center to the periphery, and what gives us the right to do that? And anthropologists would generally reply that, no, it's true that in the past, we've gone from Europe to Africa or South America and studied people in villages or tribes and now ethnic groups, but the insights we gained from that are insights that we could apply to businesses and corporations and governments. And the critical movement said, prove it. And so you had quite a lot of young people like myself saying, challenge accepted. So I decided that I would study, first of all, I would study Germans because, you can't get much more periphery to the center than studying Germans. Plus, I studied German and had lived in Germany, so it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to go from there and to build the contacts. And I also wanted to study Germans in the City of London because it seemed to me that if you want to study up, if you want to study the people at the center, then you study the people doing transnational business. And so I did, and found that in a way, the City of London is also a village, with its own little tribes and its own little customs and, its own strangenesses. And I had a very good time doing it. And after that, on the strength of that, I got offered a postdoc place by Mari Sacco, who is usually quite keen to work with qualitative researchers. And so, so since I'd gotten to know her through university activities, she suggested I come to the Said Business School and spend a year with her. And that kind of launched me off into business schools from there.
Perfect. Something that is not on your CV that people might find interesting about you.
I make miniatures for a hobby.
Miniatures of what?
miniature houses,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, miniature dioramas, little scenes,
Perfect.
started as a pandemic hobby, it's something to do to keep the mind occupied, and it's still going strong.
Perfect.
I post the pictures to Instagram.
Perfect. If you stopped doing what you're doing today, what's the second best career path for you? What would you do?
Well, I think, the other thing that I do, but which I didn't mention because most people in the AIB know about it, I think, is, I write science fiction stories and novels. And, I think if I stopped doing research today, what I'd do is I'd write full time. It would be, something I'd have to focus much more on the commercial side of it. As it is, I can focus with it as a side interest. I can focus more on projects that are of interest, and I would certainly. It's something I enjoy doing. It's something that's not a million miles from academia, and so I think I would focus much more on my writing if I stopped being an academic right now.
But the writing style is different, right?
Yeah. The writing style is different, but one of the things that I find very useful about being able to write in both registers, though, is that you can get the insights work both ways. People find it amusing that a lot of my science fiction stories are about smart cars and smart technology, but a lot of that's because this is what I spent a decade researching at BMW, and these days, of course, a lot of the innovative research is on smart tech, and so what am I reading? It's digital innovation literature, so all of that goes into the book. But in the meantime, then I come back out of it, and then I start thinking about, more seriously, academically, about how our identities change in relation to technology, and how technology comes into our lives, and what we do with it, and the sort of mixed blessing that is intelligent technology.
Interesting. Regrets. What is one thing you wish you would have done or done differently?
It might sound strange, but I actually wish I'd taken a year off after I finished my undergraduate research and went out and worked, maybe traveled a bit, but, generally taken at least a year out of academia before I committed to a full-time academic career. I mean, I don't regret, the academic career, far from it. But at the same time, when I actually started on my doctoral fieldwork and was encountering people in the City of London and people who, I quite admired, but who had quite different career paths from myself, I began thinking, maybe I was a little too focused. Maybe I should have explored other career paths before I committed to the one I had. And, to this day, I still recommend to students, if I'm director of the PhD program at the moment at Royal Holloway School of Business and Management. And if an undergraduate or a taught master's student comes to me and says, I'm interested in applying for the PhD program, I usually say, great. But I also usually say, have you worked? Have you been out there in the world? Have you, seen what else is out there? And, and if not, then, take a year, go out and do it. The PhD program will still be there when you come back. Don't worry. But, get to know yourself a bit better before you embark on postgraduate study.
But the longer they wait, it becomes more difficult to get back to being a student again, isn't it?
The longer they wait, yeah, but a year, 2 years, not so much. And also sometimes, I've known people who've taken a few years out between undergraduate and higher and postgraduate work, and it can actually be helpful because then, particularly in a applied field like business and management, because then they've they've had a chance to see how things work, and they've also had a chance to think of a good practice-based project. People who come back and say, well, I was interested in, diversity in the police force, say, to name a subject I've examined a couple of PhDs on. And, having been a policeman, I can say the police force has some issues, and I can say them from a position of experience. But I want to go back and study that scientifically, with research and theory and things, rather than just saying, my impression as a person of color in the police is that the police have a diversity problem.
Sure, correct. Well, for the sake of time, I'm going to switch to research. Say you're stranded in a pub, in a local pub. The locals are curious about you, what you do for a living. How do you explain the importance of your research and what you do to people who don't read scholarly journals?
Usually I have to explain what an anthropologist is first. And I usually actually do it with reference to psychology. I say it's kind of like doing psychology, but on groups of people and organizations. And then, when they're like, well, what's that worth? I'm like, well, groups of people and organizations, they have their problems. They have, they can benefit from learning more about themselves, from being able to see themselves, in a different way. And an anthropologist, in organizations helps organizations do that, helps them get new insights into the organization and how it works that they might not get through more conventional methods. I mean, I mentioned the BMW study, but part of how that came about was that the general manager of the mini plant said to me that they wanted to improve in a couple of ways. First, they wanted to recruit more women. And secondly, they also wanted to retain people, especially women, but more generally, they were noticing that, they had their lifetime employees, but they also had employees who would, sign up for 3 months and leave. So they were saying, what's going on? Well, the thing was, they tried their conventional metrics. They tried their exit questionnaires. They tried their stats. And they weren't getting any insights. So they said, what we want is somebody who can go and work on the line and tell us what people aren't telling us. And that's what I did. I went on the line and came back and said to them, okay, here are the I can't say here are 100% the reasons, but here are some insights that I could give you as a worker through a temporary labor agency who is female on what it is that could be improved on the line if you want to do this. And they did.
Well, okay. But we're talking about year 2000, right? We're talking about 20 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
About omitted variables in IB research, neglected areas of research in IB. What's your take on it? What are the things that we should be studying more of or reviving?
Well, this is my hobby horse, but I do think that IB could make better use of qualitative research methods in all areas, and especially ones that aren't interviews. Interviews are useful, but I think they're overused. I think looking at things like linguistic analysis, looking at ethnography, looking at critical incident studies and things like that might diversify and broaden the studies that there are. And I also think that we need perhaps to broaden some of what we think of as expatriates. We focus on expatriates because they're in companies. But for instance, is a lawyer who has fled Syria as a refugee and wants to continue to work as a lawyer, but can't, but is trying to make this the case. How do you classify them? Do you call them an expatriate? Do you call them a self-initiated expatriate? If you say, they're a migrant or a refugee, then people are going to say, well, that's not the subject of IB studies. That's migration studies. And I say, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There's an IB context right there that, maybe you need to think a little harder about to see, but it is there.
Actually, this is interesting because what you're talking about, there's an unnecessary push to put people in silos and put labels in IB. What is IB? What is not IB? Or
Yeah.
what is not IB? This is actually quite limiting. About creativity in scholarship, where do creative ideas come from? What does your mind think of in this state of idle curiosity? About curiosity, about intellectual curiosity, what can you say?
Well, I think in some ways, I think that as scholars, as well as inspiration, I think we've also in some ways got an obligation to look at what are the issues of the day. For instance, the most recent project I've been involved with was looking at national culture and dimensions of culture and responses to COVID-19. And I was really glad when this project came along because, without really having a formal project, I was recording observations, making notes about the British government and what it was doing and why. And because before the COVID happened, I was doing some work on a paper about Brexit and national culture and Brexit. And, so it kind of dovetailed in there. And I think really, this is we don't necessarily have to be inspired by the headlines, but we also have to be looking around and seeing what are the issues. Chinese investment in Africa, that's a big issue that, we need to study, for instance. The whole question of what constitutes a developing or a less developed country, that's something else we need to consider. Where are we going with all this technology? What are the moral, political, and ethical issues involved? Blockchain is well out of my sphere of influence, but again, I see so many business and issues, just in terms of how the ethics of running a currency like that and the sort of culture that it's amassed around it. It's quite different to conventional financial interests. So I think what we need to be doing is looking at what's new, what's out there, and what's changing our world right now.
Interesting. Susan Athy was talking about a couple of years ago. She had a recording at Stanford. So she is talking about the economic system as a ledger and the use of the currency and these currencies as a tool for propelling the societies forward. It really quite point exactly like you're making. I want to ask you about your perspective because you're in a unique situation about interdisciplinary versus multidisciplinary research and the progress that we have made over the years, the evolution of the field from where we are, where we were, where we are headed to. What do you think about that?
I think, I've seen a lot of progress in terms of people thinking in more complex ways and approaching problems in more complex ways, particularly to do with culture. When I started out, it was there were not so many people, for instance, working in ethnography or taking anthropological insights, but more recently, and the more AIB meetings I go to, the more people I see who are working in those areas, and even bringing in things like digital ethnography and auto ethnography. That I think when I went to my first AIB meeting in 2004, I think it was, I think most people would have been surprised to consider those part of IB. Also, I think cultural scholarship, not just from a qualitative point of view, but from a quantitative point of view, cultural scholarship is just getting more prominent, more nuanced, more developed. And I think that's all to the good. I think you can't really study international business without considering culture sooner or later at some point. And I think the more insights that we have into cultures and how they work, the better our insights into business and management in cross-cultural contexts is going to be.
About the PhD program, you mentioned you're the director of the PhD program. What's the best advice you received when you were going through the program yourself from your mentors?
Well, the best advice I got was the three key skills of an anthropologist are to be able to listen well, to talk well, and take understandable and comprehensive notes while really drunk. Because an awful lot of anthropology does happen at parties and at gatherings and other things. And yeah, so, and you're taking part. So if you can't write things down appropriately, you know, no way. But in some ways, I think one of the best bits of advice I got more seriously was actually as I was considering where to go after the PhD. And, you know, people said, you know, business studies, you know, why not try it? And, you know, and I think that was a good decision, you know, that if people hadn't said, you know, well, you know, this is a place where anthropologists can go that isn't an anthropology department, maybe I would never have done it.
Interesting. So what's the advice that you give to new PhD students or junior faculty? Listen well, talk well, don't have a slurred speech, and especially when you're intoxicated, and take good legible notes. What else?
Well, that's what I say to the ones that are planning on doing ethnography or something similar. But yeah, in more general terms, with PhD students, I would advise them, you know, focus on doing a really good PhD. You know, a lot of them feel anxious. You know, they're like, oh, I need to get a good PhD, and I also need to get in teaching experience, and I also need to get in publications in 4-star journals. And I say to them, you know, you're better off focusing and getting a really good PhD, because if you do that, the rest will follow. You know, the publications will go to 4-star journals if you've got a good PhD and a good relationship with your supervisor and your supervisor's colleagues, and you know, so you've got good co-authors. You know, the teaching, you know, often that also comes out of the PhD. You know, being able to say, you know, this is my specialty, this is where I can go, and you know, being able to say, you know, I've got a good background in research is a good trade-off to, you know, to getting a teaching post. I also say to them, you know, kind of play the long game, think long-term, you know, don't just kind of go for the first thing that, you know, you looks good, you know, think about where you want to be in 10, 20 years time, and go for there.
Which skills are difficult to develop to get a good PhD, or while getting a good PhD? You're talking about good training, right?
Yeah.
This is what, so which skills are more difficult to develop and to attain?
Well, for a qualitative researcher, I'd say, you know, developing personal rapport. You know, that's something you really need to do with the people you're working with. Even if you're doing an interview-based paper, you know, you need to be able to develop a good relationship with your interviewees. You need to also develop the sort of sense of judgment, you know, of when you can, you know, when you can take something at face value and when you maybe need to ask a few more questions, and how far you can go with that. And those are the sort of skills that I think are really hard to teach. You know, they're stuff that I think mostly comes with experience. You know, kind of also, so when you're done, you know, a lot of students, one of the first questions I get asked in any research methods class is, you know, how many interviews is enough? And I say, oh, you know, how long is a piece of string? You know, you could do a good thesis, you know, with one very, very long interview or series of interviews with one person. You could do one with 100 interviews. It depends. And part of the trick, you know, part of the discipline is really learning to develop your own sense of, right, you know, now I've done enough. I've done enough to understand the subject I was studying. And so maybe I'll need to come back, but now I can take a step back and analyze.
I had two mentors, two advisors, Odette Shankar and Jay Barney. And when they did executive ed or consulting or their research involved interviews, they actually integrated me as at least a note taker or a graduate assistant.
Yeah.
I actually learned a lot from that experience. Yeah. Do you integrate your students in your research? Do they come with you? How do they learn?
Yes and no. I mean, sadly, so far, none of my own students have really been able to do that because they've been working in different fields. I mentioned police studies. I said two of my students were working in police departments, others were with Korean business people and so forth. So we weren't able to work together. But when I was in Taiwan doing research for my most recent monograph, Global Taiwanese, they were not my students, but several of the doctoral students at the institute that I was visiting were able to come with me and help with the interviews and do translations, do the notes, provide their own insights into the experience we just had, which was just absolutely invaluable. So if anybody is thinking of doing a PhD on Taiwan in qualitative areas, please talk to me.
Uh, well, with all this experience under your belt, there must be some common mistakes that you see across the board that young scholars, junior faculty make. What are some of the things that you say, don't do it? It's just wrong and it would not be beneficial for you?
Well, I think one of the key ones is don't trust everything. Don't take everything at face value. Because again, there can be a tendency. You see a survey or you do an interview and you don't interrogate it. Somebody you conduct an interview and somebody says to you say what are things like in your organization, and they say well they're like this. And it can be tempting to say okay, right, and not think that maybe that's not the only perspective on the organization, or that maybe there's some things they can't tell you or don't want to tell you, or that they have a version of. One thing I say to people, young ethnographers, new ethnographers, is that one of the first people that will talk to you in an organization is usually somebody who's planning to leave or retire. And this is great because they will tell you lots of things that nobody else in the organization will tell you. Because they see themselves having nothing to lose. They don't have to play the political game. If they want to insult somebody, there's going to be no comeback. But you've also got to remember that that's a version, and that there's a motivation going on there. That the person is thinking to themselves, I'm leaving soon, and I want my version on the record. I want somebody writing down my story as I see it. And
it's called restitution.
yeah. And so you got to think, and even with people without an obvious axe to grind, you've got to sometimes ask yourself, why are they giving me this interview? What are they gaining from this? I'm doing the study on Taiwan. I would talk to a lot of people who were in jobs, working with organizations or chambers of commerce or whatever that had political affiliations. And so I'd have to say, okay, I'm sure they do want to contribute and help the process of research, but isn't there also an element of, we want our version out there, we want our perspective to look good, we want legitimacy. And then I talk to people from the best way to counteract this, again, as ethnographers, is to talk to lots of different people. And so I would talk to people from other organizations or different backgrounds, and I'd hear a different version, or I'd hear things not that weren't even a different version that would make me think, I think somebody else's agenda is maybe becoming a bit clearer. And I also don't want to sound cynical. I don't want to sound like I'm saying that nobody gives an interview, for because they've got an axe to grind or an agenda to push. But at the same time, every decision you make is a decision you take for reasons. And so what reasons does this person have to talk to you? What reasons do these people have to let you into their organization? You need to think about it.
Fiona, for the sake of time, the last question. What's the question that I should have asked you but haven't?
I've been thinking about that one all week, and I still don't actually have an answer.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. This was very interesting. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you for your time and all this input. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.